So in the UK, under the previous administration, they adopted the UK Low Carbon Transition Plan, and what's been interesting is that notion of transition has been resilient enough to carry over between the change of governments in the UK, and so the current coalition government also talks about enabling the transition to a green economy. So you've got a powerful policy discourse which seems to be shared across quite a wide political spectrum, which seems to be very ambitious in its goals. As I say, it is actually quite a relatively recent way of framing climate change and environmental policy, and we can really quite precisely identify its entry into the policy world through the Stern Review of 2006. The Stern Review was set up by Gordon Brown on the advice of his advisor on climate change, Michael Jacobs, deliberately to deal with potential Treasury opposition to a more socially oriented policy turn. And, you know, Stern basically, an economist who studied the problem and basically argued it would cost more not to deal with the problem now than it would by trying to address the current problem of climate change. So it's sort of legitimising an economic perspective on social intervention, and he introduced the notion of managing the transition to a low-carbon economy, and quite specifically says radical change may not be delivered by markets, and that you're going to need quite extensive support for innovations, accepting that if you're going to publicly invest in potential low-carbon technologies, you can't guarantee that all of them will succeed. So I find this quite interesting actually, because this is coming after 2 or 3 decades of a dominant neoliberal perspective on policy, which is all about avoiding the government getting too involved and spending money on these sorts of social purposes. And this sort of crept in through the back door, because I mean it wasn't that Labour had adopted a particularly interventionist policy, but suddenly there's here a new framework for justifying that type of public intervention. Now, I say that was the moment it entered the policy world, but I mean, the idea of a transition had roots prior to its entry into the policy sphere. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has produced these reports on mitigation policies over the years, and they began using the formulation of a transition to a low-carbon society. But in more academic terms, it was very much rooted in a Dutch tradition of research going back to the early 1990s, which was basically reconceptualizing the issue of innovation in terms of longer-term, more dramatic socio-technical transitions, and prominent figures in this, René Kemp and Frank Hales, and what's become a very pervasive sort of rendition of that new academic perspective was the notion that if you wanted to go for ambitious, radical transitions in terms of your economic and social activities, that this was not simply explicable in terms of supporting a specific technology, but it was about, one, unsettling the existing socio-technical arrangements around transport or housing, and then instituting some new change. And so essentially one's looking at a dominant regime, a socio-technical regime defined as a bundle of social and technological elements which deliver some sort of social use or purpose, being disrupted through the emergence of novelty under pressure from landscape influences, resulting in potential reconfiguration. And so this is reformulating the idea of innovation from its conventional preoccupation with individual products, your computer numerically controlled machine tools. I mean, those are the conventional ways of thinking about innovation around products and processes. This was saying, actually, you're talking about serious transformative change. You're actually talking about innovation within a system, not just a product or process. And so here's the idea of socio-technical innovations of a systemic nature being put on the table as a focus for policy attention. Yet, of course, most conventional policy still remains preoccupied with singular technologies. That's been the conventional focus. The conceptual roots of that notion of socio-technical transition represented, in a sense, a merging of two rather distinctive strands that have developed within the broad area of science, technology and innovation studies in the past 20 or 30 years, and that was combining the sort of neo-Schumpeterian notion of an evolutionary theory of economics, which Chris Freeman and Carlton Perez have developed very much in terms of changes in techno-economic paradigm, which are very much about the shift from a manufacturing society to an information society. So big, high-level transformation was the focus of evolutionary theories of transformation. And then this was combined with a much more micro sociological strand, which had focused very much on individual products and had sought to reveal the creation of the paths that led to those particular products. So there are interesting studies on the bicycle and how those technologies are socially constructed through the interaction between a variety of different social actors. So in a sense, this transitions framework is bringing some of the evolutionary selection environment framing of the problem together with a more situated notion of constructing new types of socio-technical paths. Okay, so we have this new framing of climate change and transition. We have some emerging new ideas about what we could mean by socio-technical transition. And then within the policy documents surrounding this new attention to the transition to a low-carbon society, you get a focus on the need for significant innovation in order to get along that path. Now, let's just unpick that for a moment. I mean, there are other models of a transition to a low-carbon economy. One, for example, is a revolutionary change in people's consumption behaviours to reduce demand. Others are rather, what's the word, over-ambitious suggestions about going down a particular technological route, such as nuclear power. Now, this framing is quite deliberately seeking a path which is avoiding either over-ambitious changes in people's personal behaviour or relying on one particular technological path. And so it's quite deliberately being framed as a realistic approach to delivering expectations of prosperity amongst the electorate while dramatically reducing its impact on the Earth's climate. And then you get this sort of rhetoric, which you really only used to read in the sort of left-wing news sheets from the 1960s, that the economy needed a fundamental transformation within a generation, and this was going to be a transformation of producer behaviour and consumer behaviour. So extraordinarily radical rhetoric within the official policy documents, and obviously not misplaced, because if you're talking about reducing your carbon emissions from a carbon-based industrial economy by 80%, you're talking about something very ambitious. So increasingly, European climate change policy, the 2020 policy, was already beginning to say, well, if we're talking about this type of transition, then we're looking at something different to traditional avenues of research-based technology programs, or to some extent reliance on rather arm's length policies like emissions trading schemes to affect the overall markets. And so there's beginning to be a recognition that this type of innovation, which could deliver a transition to a low-carbon society, needs a diversity of social actors, so it's not just going to be done by one bit of the business sector, and that it needs a diversity of innovation which addresses energy efficiency of consumption as well as about the production of energy. And in the UK, I mean, DEFRA expressed this in terms of, in 2010, these had been its conventional formulations of innovation, either incremental or radical, but basically was now talking about a new notion of transformative innovation, full system redesign and culture change in the way people think about products and services. So, we followed that new framing of climate change policy around the transition to a low-carbon society. We see how that has opened up the terrain about looking at innovation policy as a way of delivering that transition. So let's now move into the world of innovation policy, which is separate really. So I've been following this route really from the climate change policy agenda. So let's go and look at the innovation policy arena to see what it had to offer in relation to this new challenge. Now, the idea of innovation policy didn't really exist before the 1990s. There was something called science policy, which went back to the post-war period with the successes of nuclear physics in relation to the atomic bomb. So in the 50s and 60s, one was very much talking about a science policy framework for national prestige and competitiveness. This became modified over time to the notion of a science and technology policy. When I did my postgraduate work, I joined a research centre called the Technology Policy Unit, which was set up in the mid-1970s. But it wasn't until the 1990s that you actually had it reformulated as a policy about innovation rather than just a policy about science and technology. And I think my core argument is that that reframing of science and technology policy as innovation policy was not casual or accidental or trivial. It actually represented something quite significant and important. But because it emerged from what was a legacy policy arena to do with science, it sort of started to strike out into new territory, but actually carried with it many of the imprint, if you like, of its origins and roots in science policy. So, for example, in the Green Paper on Innovation in 1995, first, well, here's a new formulation of what innovation is. The successful production, assimilation and exploitation of novelty in the economic and social spheres. Well, that's far broader definition than producing a profitable product, which I mean had been, if you like, technology policy and focused very much on that. It was a multifaceted phenomenon. It was about the process of innovation as well as the results. It wasn't just about products and processes, but also services. It related to all sectors in both the commercial business sphere as well as the public social sphere. And it needed a much deeper understanding of interaction and networks, i.e. seeing it as much more of a socially interactive process rather than something which was just triggered by an investment in science, which has been the conventional science push model. So, the birth of innovation policy is accompanied by a much broader definition of innovation, crossing the social and technological boundary and crossing the public and private spheres. And so this seems to me extremely important. But at the same time, in the same documents, you also see phrases about the mastery of scientific and technical skills is essential to generate the technical advances. You've got to place science and technology at the service of industrial competitiveness and needs of the markets. You've got to strengthen the mechanisms linking basic research and innovation. And this sort of almost schizophrenic sort of policy framing of saying it's all about something different and broader, but it's really all about science and technology, remains the case. And so you can read most innovation policy documents, white papers or whatever, and it's almost as though there have been two documents written. One is about this broad, socially oriented model of innovation. The other is about science policy. And because there's been no resolution, they're sort of then mixed together. And so you're sort of riding both of these policy definitions at the same time.